Get comfortable. Adjust your pillow. Let your shoulders drop. Take one slow breath in and out. Allow gravity to pull you into your bed. Feel that dissipate off your shoulders. Tonight, we're going somewhere cold, somewhere vast and gray and ancient. We're going to the banks of the Volga River in the heart of Russia in the autumn and winter of 1942 and 1943. We're going to a place that, for a few terrible months, became the most fought-over patch of earth in the history of human warfare. Tonight, we talk about Stalingrad. Before we talk about the soldiers, before we talk about the generals and the orders and the maps drawn in candlelit bunkers, let's talk about the land itself. Because the land at Stalingrad was as much a participant in this battle as any man who walked across it. Stalingrad sits on the western bank of the Volga River in what is now southern Russia, in a region known as the Lower Volga. The city stretches for nearly 50 kilometers along the river's edge, long and narrow, like a ribbon laid across the earth. At its widest point, it is only a few kilometers deep before the open steppe begins. There is no great forest to hide in here. There are no mountains. There is only the flat, cold Russian plain, the wide gray river at your back, and the sky, enormous, unbroken, and utterly indifferent. The Volga River itself is one of the great rivers of the world. At Stalingrad, it runs wide and dark and slow, sometimes stretching more than a kilometer from bank to bank. To the east of the river lies more steppe, open, featureless land stretching toward Asia. To the west, the city. And beyond the city, more steppe, rolling away toward the Don River, and ultimately toward Europe. The city itself, in 1942, was an industrial one. It had grain elevators, chemical plants, tractor factories that had been converted to produce tanks. It had apartment blocks, workers' neighborhoods, department stores, schools. It had a central railway station, a wide central boulevard, a beautiful fountain in a public square, featuring a ring of dancing children, a fountain that would become, in the months ahead, one of the most haunting images of the war. The terrain within the city was a patchwork of rubble, steep ravines called balkas, factory complexes the size of small towns, and the occasional surviving building still standing among fields of destruction. The balkas, these dry gullies carved into the earth over centuries, would become highways of movement for soldiers trying to survive. They were the only places in the city where you could move without being shot. Now, the climate. If you have never experienced a Russian autumn transitioning into a Russian winter, it is difficult to fully describe it to someone from a more temperate part of the world. Allow me to paint the picture slowly. In August and September, Stalingrad bakes. The steppe turns brown and dusty, and the air smells of dry grass and distant fires. The sun is generous, almost brutal, and the dust coats everything. Your skin, your teeth, the barrels of guns, the pages of orders. Then, as October arrives, The temperature begins to drop. Rain comes. The ground, which had been hard-baked clay, becomes mud. Russian mud is famous among soldiers of every era, and for good reason. It is deep and clinging, thick as concrete when it dries, and thick as glue when it doesn't. Vehicles sink into it. Horses sink into it. Men sink into it. It slows everything down to a crawl. And then November comes. The first snows arrive, quietly at first, soft and white, settling over the rubble, covering the broken glass, the cracked walls, the craters. For a brief moment, the destruction is muffled, softened, almost peaceful. But then the cold truly arrives, and it arrives with authority. By December and January, temperatures in Stalingrad regularly fell to -20, -30 Celsius. That is -4 to -22 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, metal becomes brittle. Engines refuse to start. The oil in a rifle's action freezes solid, unless it is carefully maintained. Exposed skin begins to freeze within minutes. Frostbite takes fingers, toes, ears, noses. The Volga itself would freeze, eventually thick enough to walk across, then drive across, which would become critically important in ways we'll discuss shortly. This was the world the soldiers of Stalingrad occupied: cold, rubble-strewn, gray, stripped of color, stripped of comfort. The city had been flattened from above by weeks of German bombing, and in a strange way, this would work against the attackers and in favor of the defenders. The rubble created a maze, a fortress of broken brick and twisted steel, a place where every pile of debris was a potential sniper's nest, where every cellar was a potential command post, where the conventional advantages of armored warfare simply dissolved. You cannot drive a tank through a wall of rubble very easily. You cannot call in air support when the enemy is 15 meters away. In the rubble of Stalingrad, the battle would be decided not by machinery or air power, but by individual human beings, fighting room to room, floor to floor, in what the Germans would come to call, with a kind of exhausted dread, Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. To understand why Stalingrad mattered so much to both sides, we need to step back a little. By the summer of 1942, the war on the Eastern Front had been raging for over a year. Germany had launched Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941, the largest military invasion in history, and had driven deep into Soviet territory. But the Germans had failed to take Moscow in the winter of 41. The war was taking longer than anyone in Berlin had anticipated, and the logistical strain was beginning to show. Adolf Hitler, convinced that the key to defeating the Soviet Union lay in capturing its economic resources, particularly the oil fields of the Caucasus, ordered a summer offensive in the south called Case Blue, or Fall Blau. The plan called for Army Group South to sweep southeast, capture the Caucasus oil fields, and secure the flanks of the operation by taking Stalingrad along the Volga. Stalingrad was important for several reasons. It sat on the Volga, the great artery connecting central Russia to the south. Taking it would sever Soviet supply lines. It was also an industrial center, and perhaps most powerfully, it bore the name of the Soviet leader himself, Joseph Stalin. To take the city of Stalin from Stalin would be a propaganda triumph of immense psychological weight. Stalin understood this instinctively. On July 28, 1942, he issued Order Number 227, which became known simply by its grim, declarative command, "Not one step back." Soviet soldiers were told that retreat without orders was punishable by death. Behind the front lines, blocking detachments were stationed with orders to shoot deserters. The order was harsh, brutal, arguably cruel, but it communicated something essential about Soviet resolve. There would be no withdrawal from Stalingrad. The city would be held, or it would cease to exist. Let us meet the men who would shape what was about to happen. On the German side, the Sixth Army, one of the most powerful formations in the Wehrmacht, nearly 300,000 soldiers strong, was commanded by General Friedrich Paulus. Paulus was a meticulous, careful man, an excellent staff officer, deeply professional, precise in his thinking. He was not, perhaps, a man built for the chaos that Stalingrad would become. He suffered from a nervous tic that caused one side of his face to twitch. He was devoted to his orders, even when those orders would lead his men to catastrophe. He had been personally selected by Hitler to lead the assault on the city, and he would remain loyal to Hitler long past the point where loyalty had any practical meaning. On the Soviet side, the man most directly responsible for defending the city was General Vasily Zhukov, the commander of the Soviet 62nd Army, the force that would hold the west bank of the Volga. Zhukov was as different from Paulus as it is possible to be. He was rough, direct, profane, fiercely aggressive even in defense. He was known for his physical courage and his willingness to lead from very close to the front. His headquarters would be positioned barely a kilometer from the fighting, sometimes close enough to hear individual gunshots. He wore his stress on his skin, literally. Under the pressure of Stalingrad, he developed a severe eczema that covered his hands and face in painful sores, and he wrapped his hands in bandages. He directed battles with bandaged hands from a bunker on the bank of the Volga. Then there is the man whose mind would ultimately determine the outcome, not just of Stalingrad, but arguably of the entire war. General Georgy Zhukov, Deputy Supreme Commander of Soviet Forces. A man of extraordinary strategic intelligence, iron nerves, and absolute ruthlessness. Zhukov and a small team of planners, including Colonel General Alexander Vasilevsky, were already, in the early weeks of the defensive battle, sketching the outlines of something audacious, something so large, so ambitious, that it would have seemed like fantasy to most observers. A counteroffensive, not just to relieve the pressure on the city, but to encircle the entire German Sixth Army. They called it Operation Uranus, but that was still months away. First, the city had to hold. The Germans reached the outskirts of Stalingrad in mid-August 1942. On August 23rd, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, launched a massive bombing raid on the city. Hundreds of aircraft filled the sky. The city burned. The oil storage tanks on the Volga caught fire, and burning oil spilled into the river itself, turning the water into a river of flame. Thousands of civilians died in that single day. What remained? The blackened, collapsed shells of buildings, the collapsed floors and staircases and walls, became the battlefield. German forces pushed into the city through September. They made progress, brutal, costly progress. At times they held 90% of the city. The Soviet defenders were squeezed back toward the river, fighting from the rubble of factories and apartment blocks, holding individual floors of buildings, sometimes individual rooms. Here we should speak of the tactics that Zhukov developed to survive. Tactics born not from military theory, but from desperate necessity. He ordered his men to close the distance with the Germans, to hug them, as it was called, to get so close to the German lines that German artillery and air power could not be used without killing German soldiers as well. The front lines at Stalingrad were sometimes separated not by kilometers, not by hundreds of meters, but by a single corridor, a single staircase, a single wall with holes smashed through it. Fighting at that range is not like anything you see in films. It is quiet in its way. It is slow. It is a matter of grenades rolled around corners, of a knife in a dark cellar, of a shot fired from 3 meters away. It strips warfare down to its most primitive and terrible form. Let us linger for a moment in a few specific places and imagine them. The grain elevator, a massive concrete structure near the southern end of the city. Inside, a small group of Soviet soldiers, perhaps 60 men, held this building against repeated German assaults for weeks. The building was filled with grain. Soldiers ate handfuls of it to survive. The fighting inside was room to room, or rather, floor to floor, level by level. When the defenders finally ran out of ammunition and were forced to abandon what remained, only a handful walked out. The Germans, expecting many more defenders, were reportedly stunned at how few men had held them at bay. The tractor factory, called the Dzerzhinsky Tractor Factory, was still producing tanks, even while German soldiers fought inside its outer buildings. Workers in the interior would assemble a tank, and that tank would roll directly from the factory floor into battle, sometimes without even being painted. And then those same workers, when their section of the factory was threatened, would pick up rifles and fight alongside the soldiers. The snipers deserve a moment of their own. Stalingrad produced snipers of legendary skill. The rubble, the broken concrete, the collapsed floors, the endless hiding places was perfect terrain for a patient person with a rifle and good eyesight. The most famous of these was Vasily Zaitsev, a young man from the Ural Mountains who had grown up hunting deer and elk in deep snow. At Stalingrad, he adapted those same skills, The patience, the stillness, the ability to remain motionless for hours, to a very different kind of hunting. Zaitsev would eventually be credited with over 200 confirmed kills. His methods were studied and imitated. He trained other snipers, spreading his techniques through the Soviet ranks. The Germans reportedly sent their own expert sniper, a man known as Major König or Thorvald, the head of a German sniper school, specifically to eliminate Zaitsev. The two men hunted each other across the rubble for days. The duel has become legendary, and like many legends, its details are debated by historians. But the essential truth of it, two skilled, patient, dangerous human beings trying to outthink each other in the ruins of a city, feels entirely real and entirely of Stalingrad. There is a moment in the story of Stalingrad that is rarely spoken of with the quiet it deserves. And so I'll speak of it now. Every Soviet soldier, every case of ammunition, every loaf of bread and bandage and bottle of medicine that reached the 62nd Army on the west bank of the Volga had to cross the river. The Germans held the high ground overlooking the bank. Their artillery knew the exact range. Their aircraft came in daylight, and yet every night, small boats and ferries and rafts pushed out from the eastern bank into the dark current. The boats were shelled during the crossing. Men jumped overboard and drowned in the cold, black water. Some made it to the far bank and were shot crossing the open ground to reach the city. Entire boatloads vanished. There were nights when German artillery was so precise and so relentless that crossing the Volga was, statistically, more immediately lethal than almost anything happening in the city itself. Now let me be specific in a way that most bedtime stories are not. Picture a flat-bottomed wooden supply barge, 60 feet long, piled with crates of mortar rounds and loaves of black bread. 40 soldiers aboard, lying flat to reduce their profile, gripping the gunwales, listening to the creak of the wood and the slap of the black water. The opposite bank glows orange. A shell hits the water 12 meters to the left. A white column rises, then falls. The barge rocks. Someone prays out loud. Another shell, this one closer. The concussion slaps the hull like a giant's open hand. Men are thrown against each other. A crate slides overboard. The bread is gone. A third shell. This one is not close. This one lands directly on the stern of the barge. What happens when a high explosive artillery shell strikes a packed wooden vessel is not dramatic in the cinematic sense. It is instantaneous and total. The wood does not splinter cinematically. It ceases to exist in any recognizable form. The men near the impact are not thrown backward. They are simply no longer there, converted in a fraction of a second into something that is no longer a man and no longer a soldier, scattered across the surface of the water like a shadow dissolving in light. Those in the forward section of the barge are hit by fragments. Jagged, hot metal, moving at hundreds of meters per second, passing through human tissue the way a hot wire passes through wax. There is almost no sound from the men. The explosion is loud. What follows it is the creak of the surviving hull section, the hiss of steam, and the Volga doing what it has always done, moving slowly, steadily south, carrying everything placed upon it along. A second boat, following behind, pulls some survivors from the water. Not many. The crossing continues. It always continues. By some estimates, the Soviets lost more men crossing the Volga than many nations lost in their entire contribution to the war, and they crossed it every night because there was no other way, because the city had to hold, and the city could not hold without being fed. This is the part of Stalingrad that tends to be forgotten in the larger sweep of the story. The crossing, the ordinary, extraordinary, brutal act of getting men and materials from one bank to the other in the dark, night after night, under fire, in the cold, all through September and October, while Zhukov's men fought and died in the rubble. Zhukov and Vasilevsky were planning. They had noticed something that the Germans, focused entirely on the city, had perhaps not fully appreciated. The flanks of the German Sixth Army, the long line stretching north and south from Stalingrad across the open steppe, were held not by elite German divisions, but by Allied forces, Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies. These were not poorly motivated men, but they were less well-equipped, less well-supported, and spread very thinly across vast stretches of flat, vulnerable ground. Zhukov's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Punch through both flanks simultaneously. Drive south from the north and north from the south. Meet somewhere west of the city, and in doing so, encircle the entire Sixth Army, 300,000 men, inside a ring from which there would be no escape. The Soviet High Command, the Stavka, gathered forces in secret over weeks. Movements were made at night. Radio silence was maintained. When German aerial reconnaissance spotted troop concentrations, Soviet counterintelligence fed false information, suggesting the buildups were defensive in nature. On November 19th, 1942, the ground was frozen hard enough to support tanks. The temperature was around minus 18 Celsius. At dawn, over 3,000 Soviet artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along the northern flank. The sound was, by all accounts, like the world itself splitting open. The Romanian Third Army, holding that flank, was shattered within hours. Soviet tank columns poured through the gap. The following day, the southern thrust began. The Romanian Fourth Army folded as well. On November 23rd, 1942, just 4 days after the offensive began, the two Soviet spearheads met at a town called Kalach on the Don River, west of Stalingrad. The Sixth Army was surrounded. 300,000 German soldiers inside a pocket the Soviets called the Kessel, the cauldron. From this point forward, the story of Stalingrad becomes, in many ways, a story of slow, terrible attrition. Hitler refused to allow Paulus to attempt a breakout. He declared Stalingrad a fortress, a Festung, to be held at all costs. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, rashly promised that his aircraft could supply the encircled army by air. Experienced logistics officers knew immediately that this was impossible. To supply 300,000 men, the Luftwaffe would have needed to fly in over 500 tons of supplies every single day. They managed, on their best days, perhaps 100 tons. On many days, far less. Inside the pocket, the German soldiers slowly starved. Their rations were reduced week by week, first to half portions, then to quarter portions, then to a few hundred grams of bread per day, if that. Horses were slaughtered and eaten. Then the leather from harnesses was boiled for soup. Men began to die not from bullets, but from hunger, cold, and disease. Frostbite claimed limbs. Typhus and dysentery spread through the crowded cellars where men sheltered. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched a relief operation in December, Operation Winter Storm, driving armored columns toward the pocket from the southwest. For a moment, it seemed possible that Paulus's army might be saved. The relief force came within 50 kilometers of the pocket at its closest point. But Paulus, without Hitler's explicit authorization to break out and move toward the relief force, did not move. The opportunity passed. Soviet forces pushed Manstein's relief attempt back. The pocket shrank through January. Soviet forces pressed in from all sides. The airfield at Potomnik was captured on January 16th, 1943, cutting off even the inadequate air supply. The last German airfield, at Gumrog, fell shortly after. Paulus communicated to Hitler that his army was finished. Hitler responded by promoting him to Field Marshal, a promotion laden with significance, because no German field marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler was, in effect, suggesting that Paulus should take his own life rather than capitulate. Paulus did not. On January 31st, 1943, Friedrich Paulus surrendered to Soviet forces in the basement of a department store in central Stalingrad. 2 days later, the last German resistance in the northern pocket collapsed. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Of the nearly 300,000 men encircled, approximately 91,000 surrendered. Only around 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest would die in Soviet prisoner of war camps over the years that followed. Victims of the same combination of cold, disease, and starvation that had consumed their comrades in the Kessel. The numbers from Stalingrad are almost impossible to fully absorb. Total casualties, killed, wounded, captured, on both sides, combined with civilian deaths, are estimated at somewhere between 1 and 2 million people. Some historians suggest it may be higher. In roughly 6 months, in a ruined city along a dark river, more human beings died than in many entire wars. But beyond the numbers, Stalingrad meant something. It meant something that was felt immediately by soldiers on both sides. and by leaders in capitals across the world. Before Stalingrad, Germany had never lost an entire army. The myth of German military invincibility, already somewhat dented at Moscow, was now shattered completely. A German field marshal had surrendered. The Sixth Army, one of the finest formations in the Wehrmacht, had ceased to exist. The psychological blow to Germany was enormous. Public mourning was declared. Bells did not ring. Theaters closed. In the Soviet Union, the victory was electrifying. It confirmed what Stalin had always insisted, that the German advance could be stopped. More than stopped, reversed. From Stalingrad forward, Soviet forces would never again retreat permanently. The tide had turned, and everyone knew it. For the soldiers who had fought there, on both sides, Stalingrad would never fully leave them. Veterans who survived spoke of it for the rest of their lives with a particular quality in their voices. Not exactly grief, not exactly pride. Something harder to name than either. A kind of witness. They had seen something that almost no human being has ever seen, and they knew it, and they could not unknow it. The Dancing Children Fountain still stands in Stalingrad, now called Volgograd. It was restored after the war. Children played around it again. Water moved through it again. The Volga still runs wide and slow and dark past the city's edge. In winter, it still freezes. In summer, it still catches the light in long golden ribbons. The land endures. It always does. And so slowly, the story settles. The guns are quiet now. The Sixth Army is still. The Volga carries the last of the autumn leaves south toward the Caspian Sea. The snow is falling softly on the steppe, on the Balkas and the ruined walls and the factory floors and the old earth beneath all of it. Let your breathing slow as you fade. Breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. Let the cold and the gray of that distant city dissolve. You are warm. You are safe. You are asleep. Sleep well. I'll be here next time.